Hi everyone. Today we're going to sew a neckline facing. Alright, so here I have, actually start with the body. So here I have my front bodice, this is center front, neckline, shoulder, armhole, part of side seam. And then here's my back bodice, center back, neckline, shoulder, part of my armhole. We don't have the full bodice because really we're just focused on the neckline. I also have a front neckline facing and my back neckline facing. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with this. We're going to put the bodice aside for just a second and start with our front and back facing. We need to interface our facings first. So here's the right side of my facing, there's the wrong side, and then the same thing here with the back. We have a right and wrong side, right sides, wrong sides. Okay, so and we have interfacing, we're just going to fuse to it. Alright, so let's go ahead and fuse our interfacing to our facings. We're going to do it to the wrong side. And if you're using a fusible, you want to make sure that the side with the adhesive is going against the wrong side of your fabric. The side with the adhesive is typically the rougher side. Okay, there we go. Put that aside for a minute. And we're going to use a press cloth here. Make sure our iron doesn't get dirty. When I do this, I like to take my iron, put it in the middle, and just kind of quickly work my way out in each direction. I find that helps from stop from getting bubbles in the interfacing. And then once I've done that, I just kind of hold it in place for about 20 seconds or so. And I find giving it a little bit of steam really helps that glue, that adhesive really adhere to the fabric. Okay, that should be good. Check that. There it is, don't see any bubbles. Looks like it's all sticking to the fabric, no problem. So there's our front neckline facing, all set to go. And let's do our back. The front neckline was cut on fold. Our back, we have a right and a left piece. So let's go ahead and lay those out. So there's the wrong side facing up. And then we'll take our fusible interfacing, place glue side down. There we are. And let's go ahead and fuse those. And there we are. So that's all set now. Alright, so let's go ahead and put this away. Alright, so our interfacings, or sorry, our facings have been interfaced. Okay, there's center front, these are center back, shoulder seam. So now we need to go ahead and we're going to sew these together at the shoulder seam. And while we're at it, we're going to take our bodice front, which has been cut on fold. Okay, there's our bodice front. And we have two bodice backs as well. Okay. Right side has the lines on it. Wrong side has nothing on it. Okay. We're going to sew these together at the shoulder seam too by putting right sides together and stitching that. Okay, so let's go to the sewing machine and do that. Alright, we're at the machine here. We're going to start by stay stitching our necklines. So here's my front bodice facing right here. I'm going to stay stitch this neckline at a 1/2 inch just because it's cut through bias and we don't want it to stretch or anything. So let's go ahead and do that. do the back bodice facings as well. Do the neckline and the facings there. There we go. Bulb and stay stitched. Now we can sew them together at the shoulder seam. All right. So here's my front neckline facing, and I'm going to go ahead and take the back ones and line up my shoulder. So this is center back right here. Here's shoulder. So we'll put right sides together right there. Okay. And we'll just put a pin or two just to hold it in place. Alright, so there's one. And we'll do the other one as well. Putting right sides together, lining up the shoulders of the back neckline facing with the front neckline facing. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll sew these at a 1/2 inch. Okay, so here we go. We're going to stitch this at a 1/2 inch, and we're going to back tack at the beginning and at the end of it, because this is a permanent seam and we want it to stay there forever. Here we go. There's one. Let's move up this next one, and we'll stitch this shoulder at a 1/2 inch as well, back tacking at the beginning and end. Alright, so there it is. Okay, so while we're here, we're going to do the shoulder seams of our bodice. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So here's my bodice front, right here. And then I have my backs, okay? And I'm going to sew the shoulder seams to these as well. Now, I could also stay stitch my necklines, and if I was doing this for a client or something, I probably would. But the fact that I'm also about to stitch this neckline to a facing, I'm not too worried about this stretching, because if it does stretch a little bit, it will be able to ease it into that facing. But if you're newer to sewing, I would definitely suggest stay stitching your neckline at a 1/2 inch. All right, so let's go ahead, and again, I'm putting right sides together, lining up my back shoulders with my front shoulders, and we're going to stitch those at a 1/2 inch and back tack at the beginning and end. Here we go. Okay, there's one done. Let's go ahead and do the other. Okay, I'm putting right sides together and lining up that shoulder. And we'll stitch it on a 1/2 inch. Alright, there it is stitched. And if I just open this up, you can get an idea of what it looks like. Alright, so there's my shoulder seam stitched on the bodice. Alright, let's go press these seams and the neckline facing seams open. Alright, so we're ready to go ahead and press these open. Here's my neckline facing. I'm just going to press these seams open. There we go. Okay, so there's my neckline facing sewn together, and my shoulder seams have been pressed open. Let's do the same thing for the back, or for the bodice shoulder seams. There we go. All right, so here's my bodice. Okay, that's what that looks like now. Okay, and again, you could stay stitch this neckline, especially if you're new to sewing, or if this is a garment that you'll be working on a lot before you stitch the neckline facing to it. I would definitely suggest stay stitching your neckline, because if it gets handled a lot, that has a lot of potential to stretch on you. Okay, all right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to sew our neckline facing to the neckline of our bodice. All right, so I'm going to take this here, and you can see I've marked my center front notch on my neckline of my facing, and there's the center front notch of the neckline on the bodice. We're going to put those two notches together. So we're going to turn this over and put right sides together, lining up those two notches right there, and we'll pin that in. And then we'll continue working our way out towards center back. So if everything's going to plan, your shoulder seam here should line on your facing, should line up with the shoulder seam on your bodice. Okay, if it's not, then there's probably some kind of issue. So just be aware of that. Just put a pin in closer here. Okay, and we'll pin around the other side as well. Fold that back. Make sure everything's nice and flat. And again, shoulder seam should line up. Shoulder seam of facing should line up with the shoulder seam of the neckline, or the shoulder seam of the bodice. There we go. Now we're ready to go ahead and stitch on this neckline facing. Now, if I was going to put a zipper or some kind of closure in the back, I probably would not stitch this facing on all the way. I'd either first put my closure in and then put my facing on, or if I was fitting it to somebody, I would stitch my neckline facing on, but I'd stop like an inch or two, probably about 1.5 inches to 2 inches from center back until I was able to get the closure in, and then I'd finish stitching it. Just something to be aware of. Okay, so let's go ahead and sew this on. Okay, we're going to stitch this on at 1/2 inch. Back tack beginning and end. Here we go. Be careful with your seam allowance not to have your presser foot press it the opposite direction. You want to keep it nice and flat. And there we are. Okay, so now it's been stitched on. Now, what we need to do, because we have this round curve here, to be able to get this to fold in and lay nicely, we need to go ahead and snip or clip the seam allowance around this curve. We're going to clip all the way down to our stitching line, okay? Don't clip through it, just stitch, or just clip to it. Obviously, if you clip through it, you'll have a hole in your garment. You don't want that. And I'm clipping about every 1/2 inch to 5/8 or so, give or take. There we go. Okay. Also, it's pretty bulky where all this seam allowance is coming together. So I'm going to trim that seam allowance out right there at the shoulder and neckline, just to reduce some of that bulk. I'm going to do that on the facing side and on the bodice side. I'll flip it over and just trim out that extra seam allowance we don't need. All right, there it is. Okay, now something I forgot to note here earlier was this raw edge of our facing that goes around here. Once you sew in the shoulder seams of the facing, you didn't want to finish this some way. It would be easier to finish it before we sew it into the neckline of the garment. So you could overlock it, you could bias bind it, you could Hong Kong finish it, stitch in pink, turn and stitch, or maybe it's sewing to a lining or something like that. So something to be aware of before you sew it to the neckline. All right, for this demo purpose, we're not doing it just because we're focused on actually installing it. All right, so now we've clipped, we need to understitch, okay? When we understitch, we're actually going to fold the facing away from the garment, okay? And all the seam allowance, okay, so the seam allowance of the facing and the seam allowance of the bodice want to be folded in that direction, okay? Then what we're going to do is we're going to stitch very close to this seam, all right? So we're going to stitch nice and close to that seam, about 1/16 of an inch away, and we're going to stitch through our neckline facing and then catch those 2 layers of seam allowance, all right? So again, we're top stitching on our neckline facing about 1/16 of an inch away from our seam, and when we top stitch through the top of our facing, we'll catch both seam allowances, all right? And this is called understitching. What this does, it actually gives you a cleaner look on the outside. It pulls back about 1/8 of an inch of the fashion fabric to the wrong side and gives you a nice clean finish. Okay, so let's go ahead and understitch. Okay, so here you can see, here are my 2 seam allowances, the bodice, the neckline facing, and then here's my facing. The black stripes and then the red stripes are on the bodice. Okay, and I'm going to stitch on the facing side through all layers, and this is called understitching. We're going to back tack at the beginning and end. As you're doing this, you want to do a few things. You want to pull the facing and the body of the garment in 2 opposite directions, giving you a nice, clean, tight seam, okay? If you don't do that, you run the chance of the facing kind of bubbling over and stitching it down and it gets lumpy, all right? You also need to periodically check and make sure that the seam allowance here is staying going towards the facing and doesn't flip underneath the bodice, okay? We want to make sure it's all going towards the direction of the facing. So we'll keep checking that as we go. All right, here we go. Let's go ahead and stitch this. And again, stitch a little bit, and then you can stop and check and make sure it's everything's lining up and going in the right direction. And you're stitching around the circle, and it's going to be, pulling these 2 circles in opposite directions, and they're going to kind of fight you a little bit. So you're going to smooth out as you go. All right. Just checking that seam allowance, making sure it's staying in the right direction. There we go. All right, so there it is. let's go back to the cutting board and look at it. Alright, so here it is all sewn. Okay, we need to flip. So here's the right side. Okay, there's our neckline right there. We need to flip the facing to the inside now. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll flip this around. And without any pressing yet, it's actually starting to fall into place pretty nicely because of that clipping and that understitching. Actually, it's pretty good. Okay, so now let's go ahead and give this a good press. It'll be perfect. I'm going to use my ham here. And we'll just that press. Again, I'm just going to make sure it's nice and curved. Everything's laying flat. I should pull back. Should pull it back about 1/8 to 1/16 of an inch. Fabric. And we'll just keep working our way around the neckline. And there we go. Let's check the front, see how it looks. There we are. Alright, we've now successfully faced our neckline. Okay, so there's the right side, and then I'll flip it over. And there's the wrong side. And our neckline has been completely finished. Okay, so that is how you install a neckline facing. All right, everyone, good luck.